Yes, I'm Ken Liddle. I was born in County Durham, Hetley Hall, in 1937. Things were different in those days. The pubs were more acceptable. You could afford to go out. One of my good friends was a deputy at the pit. There was joiners, firemen, all kinds. And they were all very good dart players as well. I became chairman of the darts club. I started a big draw called the three-letter draw in Alnwick. I was chairman of the local darts league. I played for the Black Swan. And it's down Narrogate in Alnwick itself. And funny enough, the day I moved up here, I walked into Alnwick, and the next pub I came to was right down into Narrogate, and it was called the Black Swan. I got on very well with the landlord immediately. In fact, he bought us my first pint. Now, that was the best bit of business that fella ever did in his life. Now, on the Thursday, the Black Swan darts team, which was we were quite rich, in that we had this three-letter draw and did a lot of work for charity. We bought televisions for homes, we bought a lot of wheelchairs, and on a Thursday in Fairs Week, we ran a sports night, and I think it was at this school, at Lindisfarne. It was different age groups, and obviously there was running and jumping, and from the pit I got some ventilation tubes, which are 2 foot, and you had to crawl through them, and mind we had to return the ventilation tubes. But yes, there was all kinds that we did. Yeah. The Black Swan was, as dart clubs went, was quite rich, and we certainly used to provide a decent supper for every team that we played at the Black Swan. I was brought up from a very early age with classical music, and I still play in a string quartet. Yeah. Every Wednesday, once a year, there's a local teacher called Mr. Byrne. He had a concert with a full orchestra, a choir, and it was usually Gilbert and Sullivan. What can you call them? Extracts. And sometimes it was the whole show, but just the music. There was no libretto, no. That was every Friday, every Wednesday in Fairs Week. 2 football teams that obviously being born near Sunderland meant from very young age supporting Sunderland. It cost, I think, 1 8p in old money to go into the Roker end. And yes, I still look at the results and interested in what happens. But my favourite club, and not because they're very successful, is Liverpool. Now then, there's a little bit history about that. The manager at Liverpool in early days was a bloke called Bob Paisley. And Bob Paisley lived in the same street as my father, and even played football with my father. I've become more of a Liverpool supporter on the demise of Sunderland, I would suspect. But I've got hopes for Sunderland. Yeah, I hope we come back into the big time. In Alnwick, in the south part of Alnwick, at Oakley Parks. And the house, at the time of my moving there, 1975, belonged to the British National Coal Board. I nearly said British Coal because they changed the name from National Coal Board to British Coal sometime in the 80s. And it wasn't until 1984 probably the beginning of the strike period that they decided to sell the house, which I bought off the coal board. Semi-detached. It's a very nice estate. Yeah, there's no problems there. Nice neighbours. A policeman on that side and a vicar on the other. Canny. Yeah. I thought that the council houses should have remained as council houses. It was a step for younger people to live and probably save up for a private house on their own. And she took that step away. But I believe that the council houses should still exist. I didn't agree with Margaret Thatcher's theory at the time. I was under manager at Liddel Colliery. Liddel Colliery is 5 miles south of Alnwick, just off the A1. And I was under manager there until 1986, when the coal board closed the colliery due to geological conditions. There was about 400 men working at Liddel Colliery at the time. And there was one manager, one under manager, and the usual support staff for mechanical and electrical engineers and surveyors. They were all there in the office. Yeah. My job, basically, was to organise the safety and production of coal. We had, obviously, meetings with the unions every week. There was a consultative committee with all the different unions that were involved, like the NUM, the mechanics, the all the different unions were invited into this consultative committee. In those days, it was more dangerous working in the hand-filling situations than what it was latterly in the mechanised situation. Because in the mechanised situation, you literally had a roof of steel above you, and it was held up hydraulically with maybe 100 ton, whereas a prop only took 2 tons. That's a wood prop. A doughty prop took 20 tons, but a powered support took well over 100. The OMS, the output per man shift at the pit under hand-filling situations, was about 30 hundredweights, or 1.5 tons per man shift. And that's everybody, mind. That's people that worked on the surface, at the shafts, everybody. The OMS, output per man shift, was about 1.5 tons. In the late, say, just before, well, even after the strike, when we got together production again, this came to about 5 ton per man shift, which is a terrific lift in efficiency, and it was much more safe. The pit closed in 1986 rather, which was a year after the strike. But the strike at Liddel only lasted from May till November, something like that. And it was one of the first pits where the workmen came back to work after the strike. I know my son was on strike and he was absolutely sick, and so was his mates, of having no money. I knew he was a good worker even before he went there. He had the necessary physique to do the job, and he never let me down at all. Did his job, and other people's as well. And he wasn't the only one like that. If there's fillers. No, let's say the working unit was about 150 metres long, and every 20 metres, no, every 10 metres was a man's filling length. Now, some lengths, 10 metres, was easier than others. and the lads, they used to help each other out. So all the coal was filled off normally. When I started work at Ebleton Colliery in 1954, I was on the screens. And I was on the screens for about 3 months. And then I was sent to an underground training situation. And I think that lasted for 13 weeks. It was at Horton Colliery, which was only 2 miles off Headingley Hall. It was a Horton pit, and it was a working pit, but it had a seam of coal that was worked out. And this was the training gallery, and there was also a training school. You had to go to classes for 1 week, and then you would down the pit for the next week for 13 weeks. And after that, came back, and he worked at the shaft, the bottom of the shaft, and somebody trained you there for it. Why? They trained you until they knew you were capable of doing the job. Then the bloke that did the training, he moved to another job further into the mine. And you had to wait until somebody came down to learn your job. You taught him what you knew, how to do it, whatever. And once he was competent, you then were taken further in. And I suppose that happened over a year and a half, maybe 2 years, just on running tubs. And the tubs eventually were changed. The tub took 10 hundredweights, half a ton of coal in each tub. And they were made up in sets of 60. And they were run, 60 of them, with ropes. Round a return wheel, there was an engine, 2 miles of rope, rounded return wheel, back out, joined, and it was pulled in. And it pulled the other rope in at the same time. And then the ropes were thrown over to a full set of 60 and out, back to the shaft, and lifted 8 at a time. The speed of the cages was absolutely phenomenal. The depth of the shaft at Ebleton was 1,400 feet, and it lifted that distance in 45 seconds. So, whoosh, it was like on elastic, whoosh, get up there, and obviously there was a lot of mines acts regarding the shaft. A dangerous place if it's not done properly. I spent some time driving the shaft with the area shaft men. As I said, there was a lot more accidents in the early years rather than the latter years. I was partly involved with one fatal accident at Ebleton Colliery. And this is why I became a first aider. Mind, you had to have a first aid course in order to be a deputy, but I took it further because there was an accident, a serious accident, where a girder had dropped onto somebody's back and wherever. And my first impression was to run in the opposite direction. And I thought, no, you can't do that. Yeah. So I went to the St. John's Ambulance Brigade and became a member of St. John's Ambulance Brigade. And eventually I was a part of the first aid team for the pit. Every pit had a first aid team, and it was a competitive thing. For instance, you would walk into a room, something similar to this, and it was like walking into part of a pit. And yet there was lying a bloke with the props on top of him and coal and whatever. And you had to treat that bloke. There was also individual oral exams. Mind, they expected you to know the first aid book off by heart from the first page to the last. If you didn't come out of that exam with 10 points, saying what went wrong, It just didn't happen. But we were a very successful first aid team. There was a lot of police teams as well in those competitions. Apart from the pits, the police had them as well. So that's why I became involved with the first aid. Another time, there was another bad accident, and it was during the time prior to the strike, and the NUM were on overtime ban. This meant that when the pitmen at 10 o'clock at night went to the drift, which Whittle Colliery was just a drift, by the way, there's no shaft. It went down 500 feet, so the gradient was 1 in 3. And it's pretty steep. One or two bright lads decided to slide down the conveyor belt, which was stationary, by the way. And in fact, if it was running, it would be going in the opposite direction. The coal came up the bank. And these lads put water on the belt and slid down on plastic bags or something like that. And one of them got out of control, kicked the other one off and went in. And that was a serious. He ruptured his larynx. One of them. Another one had a broken leg, and another one had fractures of whatever. But it was very serious. Yeah. There was a lot of things you had to. It wasn't just getting coal. That was the end product, but there was so much more. You had to maintain your development. You had to ensure that the developments were there and complete when one unit finished. And you had to ensure that there was another unit available to start away when one unit finished, to maintain production. The work of a miner was hard. It was hard work. Shifting 20 tonne of coal is not an easy task, and they had to do that every day, mind, for 5 days. It's not like a footballer that he plays on a Wednesday and he's tired on the Saturday, apparently. You had to do this job every day. Mind, it's the same in building. They build houses, they've got to build them at a certain rate, and I've got no doubt there's some people with a watch and a plan and saying, this should be done by this and this. And this is what you had to do. You had to get this to a certain place at a certain time. And yes, it was an interesting job. It was interesting. If you really got wet down while you were working, I used to come out by and stick newspapers or whatever in your overalls to stop the wind hitting you as you were going out. Just cut the draft. Yeah. But it was a pretty wet pit. In fact, it was the wettest pit that I've ever been in. Even although I used to work at Dordon Colliery, 7 miles out to sea, it was the driest pit I've ever been in. I can't say anything else, but the comradeship was second to none. There's no doubt about that. I suppose it happened in the shipyards as well, where the men helped each other and worked towards a common thing, a common aim. I think I'm the last mining engineer from Whittle Colliery in the 80's above Overman. In fact, I know I am. Yeah, I thought Margaret Thatcher was very, very strong woman, very strong Prime Minister. She or our aides, our advisors, realised exactly how to work the situation and win. And first of all, she stocked up the power stations, as did Edward Heath to a certain extent. But what he didn't realise, that the power stations needed more than coal. They needed all other kinds of things. And that is what the pickets stopped going in to the power stations. Now, Margaret Thatcher knew all this, and she took the unions on, and she won. And I think what she did was right. Because the unions, and I'm a believer in unions, the unions were getting too strong. I wasn't quite a conservative, but yes, I think I was more inclined with the liberal side of things. I thought Thatcher did a canny job. My mother hated her, just as a matter of interest. Thatcher took them on and won. The unions are not half as strong these days as not a quarter as strong as what they were. The printing industry, the papers and the shipyards, the car manufacturers especially, they used to go to work at night and just sleep, and nobody did anything about it. Well, that never happened in the pits, by the way. But it used to happen in the building the cars. Yeah? Her opponent on the mining side was Arthur Scargill. Now, Arthur Scargill knew exactly what was happening. He knew exactly. But as far as I'm concerned, Scargill had another agenda. And the agenda was to overthrow the Conservative government. I think Scargill would have had a better chance, as far as the pits is concerned, if he'd given everybody a vote. But he didn't. He didn't. In fact, he didn't give some of the men a vote. The union itself split up from the NUM. I think it was something Independent Miners, UDM, Union of Democratic Miners, something like that. And it was in the Midlands. The Midlands pits did not stop. I think the strike wouldn't have lasted as long if they'd been given, everybody had been given a vote. And I'm talking about country-wise, you know. I'm not talking about locally, I'm talking about country-wise. And he might not have gotten his percentage of what he wanted. In fact, I think he knew, so he didn't give them a vote. He just said, right, out on strike. And the hotheads came out on strike. A man cannot provide for his family. It could have effect where people go to crime to get money, to feed their beds. It's the human emotion towards this is, I would imagine, quite strong. At certain times, we were wanting a empty set, that's 400 tonne, of empties into the pit, say at 4 a.m. And they didn't come. I said, well, why did you not come? She said, oh, well, the driver or the fireman didn't turn up. And says, why did you not send us a one at 6? Oh, the driver didn't turn up for that one. Says, why not put the driver and the fireman, the driver of that train with the fireman of that train, into one train and fetch us some. Oh, unions didn't allow that. And that's true, it's true. And we proved that it was cheaper to get 20 wagons in, taking 20 tonne, out of the front door onto the A1 in lorries, rather than fetch a train load in. After 2 years, British Rail said, oh, well, how about opening the line back up? Just say, okay, we'll do that as long as you put the rails in from Brotherick to the pit, which was about 4 miles. Oh, no, can I do that? So it just didn't happen. And that's why. It was there again, it was a union problem. The overtime ban was working very successfully. They were giving the management of the pits a lot of problems. And I think eventually, and the men were still getting paid, by the way, I think eventually, whatever they were after, and it must have been money, or some benefit, they would have gotten it. But No, they jumped into strikes. And as I say, strikes don't work. They don't work. The strike was the worst part of my mining career. It was slightly vicious. I felt sorry for the pitmen, I did. It was sometimes intimidating, walking through the massed pickets. Sometimes they were in good humour, sometimes they weren't. The camaraderie amongst the pitmen was 100%. And they were out. They had a great time for a month or two, no doubt about that. Hunting, shooting and fishing and all this jazz. And until they they didn't have the money. They wanted to work. I wanted them to come. I wanted everybody to come back to work, not just him. As I say, it was a sad time. Most of the time, it was Whittle men picketing Whittle Colliery, and it was a bit of banter, shall we say, a bit of banter. The pit had to be examined once every 24 hours. Every road in the pit had to be examined every 24 hours. Now, the deputies did this, but they only worked 1 week in 3, something like that. But all our workings were covered statutorily by law. There was an atmosphere, but that atmosphere changed. In fact, in the late 86s, was one of our most productive times, or the early 86 after the strike, because that started a bonus scheme. Now, that bonus scheme hadn't existed prior to. Every day is a day less in the life of the colliery. There is limits to how far you could go and how deep you could go or whatever. There is a limit on a colliery life. Now, some collieries were very near that limit. I'm not saying I agree with the buying coal of anybody. On the contrary, I think we could have provided our coal very nicely, thanks. They subsidised their coal production to the tune of £35 a tonne to make it economically viable to ship to this country. In fact, South Africa was getting coal, loading it and shipping it from South Africa to the ports in England cheaper than what we could get it at the pit. And there was no subsidies involved with the coal board, none. Nobody wins with a strike, nobody. The men can never make their wages up. If you imagine losing half a year's work, half a year, and say you were on £5,000 or losing, it takes a long time to get that money back. In fact, it's practically impossible. Nobody wins.